Well, I won't try to match the eloquence of my respected parliamentary colleague Shashanta Kumar. Certainly, everything he said made eminent sense. Listening earlier to the comments of Shikuldeep Nair and having delved into the book of Mr. Bhanu Dhamija, I have a bit of a problem because here I have a gentleman, a very distinguished gentleman, who is pro-Nehru and anti the president idea, and here I have a gentleman who's anti-Nehru and pro the present idea. And I can't agree 100% with either of them, so I have to come around and find the balance. As is probably known to those of you who've read some of my writings on the subject, I happen to share Mr. Shantakumar's view that the parliamentary system, as we've practiced it for the last 70 years almost, has clearly demonstrated some very severe flaws and shortcomings, and that it is therefore really time to look at an alternative. It should be stressed that the alternative was very much on the table from the very beginning. In fact, way back in 1930, when the Cabinet sent a commission over led by Lord Simon to look at the various possibilities of future government for India, Clement Attlee, who later became the Prime Minister of Britain, was a member of that commission. And he had the job of speaking to Indian leaders about whether a presidential system or a parliamentary system should be followed in India. And he personally thought a presidential system made more sense. But as he said, the Indian leaders of the day rejected this with great emphasis. And he wrote, "They seemed to think I was offering them margarine instead of butter." Now, the reason for this, of course, is very clear. Very much like the American nationalists of the 1770s, the Indian nationalists of the 1930s and 40s were fighting for the rights of Englishmen. They saw that the British had ruled us for almost 200 years. They had created a great deal of respect for British superiority of arms and of institutions. And so Indian leaders tended to think that the model to aspire to was what the British had. If they could rule us, maybe we would do better if we ruled ourselves the way they ruled us. And so Westminster became the aspiration. And I was very struck, for example, how in the 1950s, after independence, even a communist leader like Hiren Mukherjee used to compliment himself and his parliamentary colleagues on the fact that the visiting British Prime Minister Anthony Eden actually felt more at home in the Indian Parliament than in the Australian. That India was the more authentic imitation of the British system. So that generation had that veneration for British institutions, and understandably it was impossible for them to be critical of it. I know Bhanu Dhamija has been very unfair to my hero, Mr. Nehru, and let me explain why he's been unfair. As Shanta Kumarji rightly said, I think the nationalist leaders of that time acted with a great deal of responsibility and sincerity and integrity. They weighed the available options and they came to a conclusion. It may not be the conclusion that today we would make. But at the time, even though very many were in favor of a directly elected president for the country, I think the concern of people like Nehruji and even Dr. Ambedkar, whose view turned from where it had started, the view was that in a system like ours, with the diversity we had, that it would be wiser to allow as wide a range of different points of view, which could be manifested, they felt, more easily through electing responsible legislators who would then choose the executive. Now, Dr. Ambedkar made a speech in the Constituent Assembly where he actually discussed this issue of parliamentary versus presidential. And he said that basically the presidential system assures you more stability, predictable term of office and so on. The parliamentary system, he says, assures you more responsibility. I think today we would use the word accountability, that you're more responsible to the electorate because in the parliamentary system you are dealing directly with the people who elected you. Now, to my mind, that was a choice made with honesty and integrity. So I think Mr. Dhamija is a bit unfair in suggesting that it was sort of the whims of one leader that gave us the system. The Constituent Assembly had a galaxy of very important influential leaders, and it was ultimately a document accepted by them, by acclamation, signed by all of them, and we should accept it in good faith. But how has the system worked in practice? There Shantakumarji has told us about his own experience. Let me say too that as far as we can see, the fundamental flaws of the parliamentary system have become more apparent during the 25 years of coalition governance we've had until the present situation. In fact, the present situation is the one thing that gives me pause. Mr. Kuldeep Nair said he was in favour of the presidential system until Mrs. Indira Gandhi came to power. I have to say that I was in favour of the presidential system until Mr. Narendra Modi came to power. Then I have to worry a little bit about where that idea might go. But let me keep the distinction at one of serious sort of intellectual engagement or theoretical engagement, and not worry about specific individuals or specific times. Because I think, as Mr. Shantakumar said, we need to discuss the issue. It may not be for today or tomorrow that any change is feasible. Certainly I don't have any reason to believe any change is feasible, because the only ones who can make the change are those who are experts at operating the present system and therefore have a vested interest in preserving it and will not want to see a change. So I'm not sure a change will come, but the idea is worth discussing. And the idea is worth discussing because, as we saw, the fundamental flaw in the parliamentary system is that you have an executive that is created by the legislature. And so the survival of the executive depends on the whims of the legislature, which means that, particularly in an era of coalition governance, the executive has to spend more time keeping itself in power. I think it was expressed more colourfully by Shantakumarji, keeping itself in power and worrying about its support base than it spends on governance. So the focus of the executive, which should be governance, is massively diluted by the necessity of focusing on maintaining a parliamentary majority. That is the first major flaw. The second major flaw is that in electing the legislature, we also attract the wrong sort of person. Because the person who is contesting for the legislature is not contesting in order to write better laws. He or she is contesting in order to be a minister, to form a government, to exercise power. So the result is we get legislators who are unqualified to legislate, as a result of which the abdication of the responsibility of law writing to the bureaucracy is now complete. And we get an executive that may be electable but is not necessarily able. So this is the other very major flaw of our system as we have seen it. It is, to my mind, rather a British perversity to elect a legislature in order to create an executive. There the presidential form of government is much more clear. It gives you a very clear separation of powers between the three branches of government, the legislature, the executive and the judiciary. Each has its own domain, each is co-equal, and each functions within its own framework. So, for example, one advantage we would have of a presidential system is that the president would be elected for a fixed term of office, 4 years, 5 years. I think 5 years makes more sense in our country, maybe 6 if you want, during which time he or she is not vulnerable to a legislative majority. So it doesn't matter what the majority is, he or she has a period of time to demonstrate what they can accomplish. At the same time, it is necessary to avoid the risk of a president becoming too powerful by balancing the authority of a directly elected president with directly elected chief executives in the states. I don't think we will need both a governor and a chief minister. I think we should merge the two functions in one directly elected chief executive who would be elected by all the people. And we should carry the logic further. We should have directly elected mayors. We should have directly elected village panchayat chiefs. Because executive responsibility delivers results. A person is voted on a platform of promises, has a time during which he or she can deliver, and that is what the voters want to see. The parliamentary system made sense in a tiny island state in Western Europe, where when the system was invented, your electoral district was barely a few thousand voters. Even today, most British parliamentary constituencies are less than 1 lakh voters. So that door-to-door campaigning is there. The person genuinely is known to the electorate personally. The person is elected on that basis, is accountable to those voters, and those voters know him well enough, he knows their wishes well enough that he knows thereafter how to represent their interests in Parliament. The Burkean view that once you've elected me, I am free to vote my own conscience, but I know what you want and you can trust me because you know who I am. But that doesn't work in India, where each of us represents about 2 million people. Each MP in the Lok Sabha represents about 2 million people, and in some cases in North India even more than 2 million people. So in those circumstances, that immediate connection between the voter and the MP is not there as in the British system. The British system also has coherent political ideologies. Everybody knows pretty much that you get one set of economic policies and social policies with the Conservatives, you get a different set of economic and social policies with the Labour Party, and you get something somewhat more peculiar when it comes to the Liberal Democrats. We don't quite know where they stand, but anyway. So you've got these ideas, and everyone knows when you vote for a party label exactly what you're voting for. In our system, for the longest time, until the rise of the BJP, and I'll come back to that in a second because even the BJP had a different manifesto till quite recently, every party was a variant of the Nehruvian consensus. Every party subscribed to a greater or lesser degree to socialism, to state control of the economy in many ways, to various kinds of attitudes to the world, to social life, to international relations, and the differences were very, very nominal. Even the BJP, that was my point, officially subscribed to something called Gandhian socialism. Gandhian socialism as opposed to Nehruvian socialism, I'm not sure, but whatever it may be, there was a broad consensus, so much so that the individual voter was voting really for personalities. In the 1971 elections, I was a child, but I remember the election posters of the Congress candidates anywhere in the country would bear the picture of Mrs. Indira Gandhi and not of the candidate. Because the idea is you want Mrs. Gandhi to be Prime Minister, you vote for me. Now you may as well give the voter a chance, vote for Mrs. Gandhi to be President directly. Why this pretense of having to vote for somebody else? And frankly, I think Mr. Modi won the election last time. And again, he had to get various other people elected. Only the people of Varanasi officially have a claim to Mr. Modi today. The rest of the nation, as Shantakumarji says, does not have a direct connection to their chief executive. Not even to their chief executive in the state, because the chief minister is also somebody who represents one constituency and not the whole state. This must end. Now the argument that presidential system lends itself to dictatorship, I have disposed of by saying you balance an elected president with an elected chief minister or governor, an elected panchayat head, an elected mayor. Then the other argument that some friends make, in fact some of my American friends, Bhanuji has lived in America and come up with a great faith in the American system, and to some degree I have, is that look at us in America, we have a presidential system, but we have complete gridlock in our US Congress, which is their term for their parliament, and that nothing is getting done because the two parties cannot agree. To which my answer is, but this is India, it's not America. In India, you never have a two-party gridlock, because right now, even after the Modi wave of 2014, we have 45 parties in parliament. So there will never be a situation of two parties constantly blocking each other. What you will have is that these 45 parties will be there, there are different stands on different issues, and a president would have to then form issue-based coalitions. So on one issue, you might be able to get the Congress and the BJP together on one platform. On a different issue, you might be getting the Samajwadi and the JDU and the Congress on a different platform. On a third issue, the BJP may find a different ally or whatever. And it doesn't matter, because in a presidential system, if he wins a vote, he continues as president. If he loses a vote, he continues as president. He just has to form coalitions and see what the country is prepared to support, what the traffic will bear. So to my mind, given the reality of our country, the diversity of our people, the fragmentation of views, the multiplicity of political parties, the presidential system would actually work better than the parliamentary system. Now, one final concern that I as a South Indian ought to have is that given the population imbalance in our country, can somebody from the South, somebody from a minority community, a Muslim, a Northeasterner, a Keralite, ever be elected president when the majority of the electorate would be people who understand Mr. Shantakumar well? Now, the answer to that is that one can only look at the examples around the world. A country like Jamaica, which is 97% black, elected a white man as Prime Minister, Edward Seahan. A country like Guyana, which is 99% either African or Indian, elected a white Jewish American woman as their president. She happened to be the widow of a popular nationalist leader, but that too has a familiar ring in India. A country like India, with the rich diversity that it has, might end up electing more UPites as president. Might. After all, even under the parliamentary system, 7 of our first 11 prime ministers came from UP. It's not that there's something in the water of UP that makes you specially qualified to be prime minister, right? But at the same time, it seems to me that just as people can establish their place, their hold on the national imagination, so that can happen in India too, and somebody from a different part of the country just might be able to appeal. I mean, in a country like Kenya, which has a presidential system, and they have tribes where we have our castes, President Daniel Arap Moi represented a tribe that only accounted for 11% of the population. By no means a dominant tribe in that country. So there are examples one can come up with. I would do one thing further from the American system. I would insist that we have also an electoral college. People would vote directly for the president, but the result that would matter would be whether he wins a state or he or she wins a state or not. And the state would have a certain number of votes in the final electoral college, and that would be a way of balancing the demographic strength of the Hindi-speaking North with the necessity of balancing the interests of the southern states and northeastern states and so on, so that we don't end up in a situation where it is only a UPite or a Himachali who keeps winning and becomes Prime Minister looking like this all the time, and therefore the rest of the country begins to feel alienated. That would not be good for the country. So in other words, you can have a presidential system anticipating all these objections and coming up with sufficient safeguards that we preserve our democracy, we preserve our diversity, we preserve our freedom, we do not surrender to a dictator, and at the same time we have accountability and performance, which is what we want in our country. We want to elect a chief executive to deliver results. Shantakumarji gives so many examples, I don't want to repeat them, of how the needs of this country are so great. And how much of our time, how much of a prime minister's time or a ruling party's time is truly spent on ensuring an end to malnutrition or hunger, on ensuring that we do better in the Human Development Index, on ensuring that black money is pushed out of politics. Seriously, you have to ask yourself. And how much time is spent on the process of staying in power, of winning more seats. Every 6 months, somewhere in this country, we have an election because, thanks to the parliamentary system, in the various states, governments have risen and fallen at different times, depending on when they lost their majorities. So every 6 months, you have an election. Our Prime Minister has spent more time electioneering than in governing this country, either electioneering or travelling abroad, even without Mrs. Amir Khan, right? So the fact is that in our country, we need a directly elected chief executive who can truly concentrate on the business of governance and who can be held accountable for the results that he or she gives the people of India. And for that, very clearly, one can make a compelling argument. Bhanu Dhamija is right that India needs a presidential system. I too join the others in congratulating him on having thought this through. He's done a lot of research. You'll be very impressed with the amount of documentation, footnotes, reading he has done. Though he hasn't read my article in Tehelka on the subject, but he has now done so. I gave it to him a few minutes ago. His arguments are strong. I only regret that he wrongly blames Nehruji for far too much. Poor Nehruji has become somehow the target for everything that's wrong in the country, you blame one man. And there Kuldeep Nayar Sahab is absolutely correct. That is wrong. Much of what we are, for good or for ill, is because of the extraordinary mind and the extraordinary efforts of Mr. Nehru. But the one thing no one can take away from him is he was undoubtedly a Democrat, a true, convinced Democrat. And I can give you example after example. In fact, even when it comes to his dominance as Prime Minister after Patel's death, no one could challenge him. But whenever he was challenged in his own cabinet, his instinct was to offer his resignation. It was not the instinct of a tyrant. He actually said, all right, in that case, you have it your way, I'm leaving. And they were all coming, please stay, we'll accept it your way. But then in 57, after 10 years as Prime Minister, he genuinely wanted to leave. He actually resigned and made a 6-month trekking plan in the Kashmiri Himalayas. And it was only when the entire country rose up and there were letters coming from Eisenhower and Khrushchev and saying, please don't go, that Nehruji finally was persuaded to reduce his 6-month holiday into a 3-week trekking holiday and come back and continue. Kuldeep Nayar Sahab will tell you all these stories. So, and I can give you another example of a separation of powers we're talking about with the judiciary. One occasion, Mr. Nehru, who was sometimes a bit hot-tempered, made an intemperate remark about a judge at a press conference. Before the evening was over, he had apologized to the judge and he had written an abject letter to the Chief Justice of India begging forgiveness for having insulted the judiciary. Now, why did he do that? No one would have dared challenge Nehruji. The judge wouldn't have called him for contempt or whatever. But Nehruji knew that for the system of democracy in India to survive, the most powerful had to show respect for institutions. And that, I think, is why I don't accept Bhanu Dhamija's point that this is all created to enable Mr. Nehru having more power. Mr. Nehru, I think, in many ways would have had more power as a president than as a prime minister. But he wanted to instill the habits of democracy in our country and in our people. And that is the only thing that I wanted to stress on that point. But the idea of a presidential system, we have no quarrel with each other on that. I think that I'm very glad that through this book, HarperCollins and Mr. Dhamija have helped revive a debate that benefits from the eloquence of Shanta Kumarji, from the recent historical experience of Kuldeep Nayarji, from the sort of arguments of individuals like myself who have studied the systems of many countries. And I do believe that if we have a serious debate on our system of governance, as Shanta Kumarji suggests, that there may well be many skeptics about the presidential system who would have a reason to think again and perhaps see the merit of what we have to say. Congratulations again, all the best and success to you.